Hello, my name is Yura and welcome to another Baldur's Gate 3 build video. In today's video I'll be showing you my Minthara build, which is going to be a build that is inspired by Minthara for Minthara, if that makes any sense. So we're going to go primarily as a Paladin, and we're going to be utilizing most of her or all of her equipment, on top of adding some additional ones that we find throughout the game. I did try to do this build with a monk multi-class so that we use dexterity instead of strength for our attacks, but that didn't work out too well. So instead, we're going to be compensating for the low strength that we will have initially with elixirs of heal gen strength, which in the end, overall, when the build is finished, it all works out quite nicely. So let's get into the creation. So of course, this is for Minthara, you will meet her in Act 2, or you'll be able to recruit her in Act 2 at around levels between 6 to 7 or 8. And you will be basically well off throughout most of the beginnings of this build, since you'll have those levels to begin with anyway. You could do this build with any other character you may wish. If you want to do it with other origin characters or with a custom character, it's completely fine. It's gonna work just fine. So anyway, for Minthara, she is a drow elf. As drow elves, they get drow weapon training, but that won't be too useful for us since we will be having paladin and fighter level, so we'll have efficiency with all armors and weapons. Though she does have superior dark vision, which is quite nice. You get to see in the dark up to 80 feet. And we also have a Fey ancestry, which makes us immune to being put to sleep by magic. And we also have advantage on being charmed, or saving on the saving throw against being charmed. As a drow, she gets dancing lights for a cantrip, which is quite useful because with this character, we'll be focusing around getting a lot of concentrating spells where we can get benefits from her boots and a specific ring. But this is kind of like a last resort spell you need to concentrate on if you run out of spell slots and you don't have anything else to concentrate on. She's also a Lordsworn Drow as a default. For our class, we're of course going as a Paladin. We're going to get the Lay on Hands, which is a quite decent heal, although since we won't be going for full 12 levels of Paladin, this will not be as powerful as you would with a full level Paladin, but it's still useful regardless. We also get the Divine Sense. We get advantage against attack rolls on Celestial Fiends and it for 2 turns as a bonus action. Pretty useful little class feature there also. And of course our channel charges, which are used for our subclass, our Oath. So we're going as a Oath of Vengeance Paladin. With this we get the Inquisitor's Might, so we can infuse our or our allies' weapons to deal additional 3 radiant damage and it dazes enemies for 1 turn. This scales with your Charisma modifier. We will not be using this, and well, we would be using it if we were going from level 1, but since we get Minthara quite late or throughout in the middle of the game, we'll get something much better in a bit. And then Oath of Vengeance Tenets is just sort of the guidelines of how not to break your oath. For our abilities, we're going with 17 Dexterity, 14 Constitution, 10 Wisdom, and 16 Charisma. High Dexterity is important here because we will be running her light armor, so we will want to get as much armor class from Dexterity as possible, and this is also going to be quite very useful because we're going to have relatively high initiative. 14 Constitution is here. It's not as high as we would normally want to have it on a character that would focus on conjuring spells, but since we will have a built-in Warcaster with our armor, and from my testing and so on, I noticed that you don't actually break your concentration that much anyway, so 14 Constitution is going to be just fine. 10 Wisdom is here going to help us with mainly Wisdom saving throws against spells like Hold Person and similar, which are the most common ones. And then lastly, 16 Charisma. This is here for our own spell save DC and for bonuses such as the Oath of Protection, so we get extra rolls on our saving throws, which is going to be very useful for both us and our allies. Now for the skill proficiencies, since most likely you probably won't have dialogue with Minthara at all since you get it so late, you can simply ignore these. Well, we can only get intimidation anyway, so we're gonna ignore that. I would keep it at insight. Insight is quite useful. Medicine and religion aren't all that great, so athletics that we have here, I would keep it with that. Alright, so at level 2 we unlock our fighting style and our spells, as well as the Divine Smite. So for the fighting style, I was just going for defense, so we get a little bit of extra armor class. Dueling, great weapon fighting, and protection we can't really get use out of because we will be dual wielding 2 maces, so none of these will work with that. So you gotta kind of have to go with defense. We'll be getting dual wielding a little bit later at level 7, because since again you will find Minthara between level 6 to 8, depending on how quickly you go to the Moonrise Towers. So we'll have it all set up before we actually head out with her. Anyway, for our spells here, now since we do have relatively high charisma, we can take something like Command Spell. We could also take something like the Operation for Evil and Good, or Shield of Faith. These are great for keeping our concentration on to have all of our buffs up and running. We of course want to also take all of the flavors of Divine Smites because all of these have useful effects. The Seeing Smite great against enemies that are vulnerable to fire. Wrathful Smite can frighten enemies and make them immobile and have disadvantage on attacks, and then Thunderous Smite can knock them prone. And if you don't have the Gloves of Heroism that give you Heroism when you use your Channel Oath charge, then you can use Heroism here instead. Otherwise, you could even take something like Bless or, as mentioned earlier, Shield of Faith and Protection from Evil and Good. At level 3, we unlock our 2 new class actions, one of them being the Abjure Enemy. What this does is it frightens an enemy, they'll have disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks, and they cannot move. This lasts for 3 turns. And you have enemies that are fiends and undead, they have disadvantage against the saving throw. If they succeed the saving throw, they are slowed instead. Now this is a pretty decent one, but the second one is much better, especially because I believe it is bugged. So what this does is you basically choose an enemy you want to have advantage against for 10 turns. There is no saving throw, you just get advantage for free. And if you, speaking of the bug, if you choose this and you select yourself, then you get advantage against all enemies for 10 turns regardless. So hopefully this doesn't get fixed anytime soon because it is a very nice feature, but I can see it getting fixed because it is very powerful. Then for the old spells that we get at level 3, we get Bane. This is basically a reversed Bless. Instead of giving you a 1d4 bonus, it gives you a 1d4 penalty to enemies. And then we have Hunter's Mark. So this one is going to be quite useful for us, since again we're going to try to be concentrating on spells at all times. This one is great for this because it lasts until long rest or until we break concentration, and we can keep recasting it for free as soon as our previous target dies. So this is going to be the one that you will probably focus on the most, unless you need something defensive like, for example, the protection from Evil and Good. And it's going to give you a little bit of an increase in damage, on top of course your smites. Then for racial spell, we unlock the Fairy Fire. What this does is all targets within the light turn invisible, and attack rolls against them have advantage if they fail the saving throw. This can also catch your allies, so your allies can potentially also get this effect on them. Then enemies will have advantage against them. So this is something to keep in mind of. But it's going to also be useful for us It's going to be quite useful for us as well because it's a concentration spell, so we have another one to concentrate on. And then for the prepared spells, you could take the mentioned earlier Bless, Shield of Faith, or Protection from Evil and Good. I will go with Protection from Evil and Good in this case. At level 4, we get an additional spell slot, and here I will be taking Shield of Faith. And then for our first feat, we're going to go with the Dual Wielder. This is going to allow us to duel with 2 maces, one of them being Minthara's mace that you find in Act 1, and then another one will be the Mantin mace, but we'll get into the equipment in a moment. What Dual Wielder does, it allows you to dual wield weapons that aren't light, so maces, flails, morning stars, and so on. You gain +1 to armor class while wielding a weapon in each hand, and you also cannot dual wield 2 harder weapons, which makes sense. You can't really dual wield 2 greatswords. At level 5, we get our extra attack, and we also unlock 2nd level spells for our Paladin. The 2 old spells that we get is the Hold Person. We basically hold the humanoid enemy still. They can't move, act, or react, and attacks within 10 feet are always critical. This is an absolutely amazing spell that we get, and we can relatively reliably use it against our enemies since we have somewhat decent charisma. But the second one we get here is much better, much more utility, which is the Misty Step, which is going to allow us to teleport to an unoccupied space that we can see within 60 feet, which is pretty amazing. We also get another racial spell, which in this case is Darkness. It's going to be quite useful for us since, of course, it is another concentration spell. Now, we don't necessarily need to cast this on ourselves, on our enemies. We can just cast it somewhere to the sides, just so we get the concentration benefits. But of course, you can always cast it on ranged enemies to blind them and force them to move outside of it. Then for the prepared spells, what I would suggest is just taking the Branding Smite. This is going to give you another smite flavor. This one is particularly useful because if you use this on an enemy, they can no longer turn invisible unless they save the saving throw. Finally, at level 6, we get our Aura Protection. This is going to give us a plus our Charisma modifier to saving throws, so it's going to be at this point +3. We can increase it later to a +4 with the Mirror of Loss. I also mentioned that if either at level 5 or level 4 when you get the feat, if you deal with Anti-Ethel, you can get +1 into the ability modifiers. Now, since this is Minthara and you get her in Act 2, you could preemptively save a +1 into Dexterity and carry it into Act 2 to give it to her. But if you don't do it, that's also fine. It's not too much of a big deal, although you will not be getting 18 dexterity, you will be stuck with 17. And then for the last spell from the Paladin we'll be getting here, I was just taking the Lesser Restoration. It is a quite nice one, especially if you need to save an ally from paralysis if you are fighting some of the enemies that do like to paralyze you, especially in Act 3. At level 7, we're going to be starting our multi-class, and here we're going to go with Fighter. Fighter is going to allow us to get a fighting style, specifically the 2-weapon fighting. What this is going to do is when we make an offhand attack with our weapon, we can add our ability modifier to the damage dealt. So before, our mace would deal a 1d6 damage, but now it's going to deal 1d6 plus 3, which is going to be quite helpful. We also get as a fighter, of course, the second win ability, which is the 1d10 plus fighter heal, although it won't be too powerful as we'll be only getting 2 fighter levels. Speaking of, at level 8, we are getting our second fighter level, and this is going to be the last one we go into fighter. So moving on to level 9, we're going to multi-class now into rogue. We want to go as a rogue because we want to get a second bonus action, which is going to allow us to attack 4 times per turn. Now for the skills here, you could, if you do not have a lockpick for a reason, go with sleight of hand, so you have a decent lockpicking chances. Although in my case, I don't really need it. I also don't need her to have expertise in persuasion. Instead, I'm going to give her expertise in, insight. And I will also give her proficiency in investigation, because investigation is pretty useful, and also give her expertise. You could also do acrobatics and expertise in athletics. Those will be also quite fine. Again, we don't need any dialogue skills. You could also, actually, now that I think of it, I'm gonna give her expertise in perception instead of investigation, because perception is quite handy because you need to find hidden buttons or invisible buttons, levers, and so on. At level 10, we gain our cunning actions, and we can move on to level 3. At level 11, rogue level 3, we get our second bonus action, which is going to be quite helpful since this gives us a lot more versatility and also more damage if we attack with it. And lastly, at level 12, we get our second and last feat, and here we're going to be taking Savage Attacker. What Savage Attacker does is when making melee attacks with weapons, you roll your damage die twice and you use the highest result. So basically, on average, you deal increased damage. This effect also works with additional effects or damage instances that you do with your weapons. For example, with Divine Smite, it's gonna reroll the Divine Smite radiant damage dice as well, increasing their damage on average as well. Alright, so that is it for the levels, and I'll see you in the equipment section. Alright, so here we are in the equipment section. So before we start with our actual equipment, let's go visit the illithid powers. Now, Minthara is one of the few companions that actually willingly would take the astral tadpole, and here we get quite a nice few stuff for her, as I think it is also quite fitting for Minthara to actually use the illithid powers. So let's start from the bottom here. The one you get for free as soon as you take the astral tadpole is the fly ability. This gives you a flight action that only costs you movement, it doesn't cost you an action or a bonus action at all. Now, most of these I will not be going through in detail. I'll just be skipping over them because some of them are like, for example, Force Tunnel and Displays, they're like, I would call them roadblocks for you to spend your tadpoles in order to get Black Hole. Now, there is actually worth going for them, because if you unlock all of them, it makes the Cold Week a lot more powerful. Cold Week and Black Hole, I think, probably are the most two powerful illithid powers that you can get. So let's actually deal with these two right now. So if you go down here, if you go through Force Tunnel and Displays, Force Tunnel is Night Form ability, and Displays deals extra damage to enemies that you cause them if they take falling damage from it. But what Black Hole does is you create a point of intense gravity that pulls all nearby enemies and possibly slows them. So this is a great ability for grouping enemies in a spot, then slowing them. What slowing does, it halves their speed. It also reduces the armor class, and it makes them only be able to use an action or a bonus action. Otherwise, yeah, that's about it. It essentially significantly hinders them. It's a very powerful one. It allows you to cast Black Hole 5 more times after using it. After that, you have to take a short rest before you can cast again. So the fact that it's a short rest one, it's really good. So it is a really good one for setting up big damages on a lot of enemies. Then the second one I mentioned here was the Cold Week. Now what Cold Week does is the more illithid powers you have, the more powerful it gets. When you bring a creature down to fewer hit points than your number of evolved powers, it dies and all nearby creatures take psychic damage. So example, if you have, let's say, 20 illithid powers and enemies you attack, they have 19 or less hit points, they instantly die. And this can synergize greatly with, for example, Psionic Backlash, When an enemy within 30 feet casts a spell, you can use a reaction to inflict 1d4 psychic damage to the caster per spell's level. So basically, if it's a level 2 spell, it's a 2d4. And this can this benefits from each other, because you can then, over the end turn, when it's for your reaction, you can end up killing an enemy with Call the Weak. So a really useful one to have there. Then while we are down here, let's take a look at the Mind Blast. Mind Blast is great because you spew forth a conical wave of psychic energy and possibly stun targets within. This does not affect allies, so you can cast this freely around your allies. Although beware of the NPC allies. If you are targeting them, you will get like a ring around their character model, so you will know if it's targeting those allies and not if it's targeting them or not. So keep that in mind. But the rest of your party, it will not target. Then going to the right side, we have Favorable Beginnings. The Favorable Beginnings, it's actually quite nice. The first attack or ability check you make against any target, you get a bonus from your proficiency bonus. So a higher chance to hit, or I believe a easier chance to persuade, for example. So it's a decent one. It only works once on a target, on every new target, but it's decent. Then we have Charm here. Charm is another one that it's kind of like a roadblock because you want to get psionic dominance. What Charm does, if an enemy attacks you, you can charm them and then they do not attack you for the rest of that turn. But what psionic dominance does, it's essentially a free counterspell that can only counterspell levels that are level 4 or lower. So what it does is when an enemy casts a spell within 60 feet of you that is lower than your proficiency bonus, you can use a reaction to nullify the spell. So basically, yeah, a counter spell that works only on spells between levels 1 to 4. Then another useful one is the Luck of the Far Realms. Now I didn't take it because it's a lot of reactions prompts unless you use it or you turn it off. So what this does is once per long rest, you can change a successful attack roll on a foe into a critical hit. So you basically get a banked up guaranteed critical hit against an enemy with this. Illithid Expertise, it is useful for dialogues, and since this is Minthara, we won't be really taking a look at that. Ability Drain. Once per turn when you make an attack, the attack reduces the target's corresponding ability. The reduction ability score can be decreased lower than 1. So if it could, this would be really good, because if your ability modifiers go to 0, you basically just die. But if you reduce enemies' strength, for example, you then hinder them with their combat capabilities, where, of course, the less strength you have, the less you're efficient with your strength-based weapons, unless you are a finesse-based fighter. But then it should decrease finesse. Fracture Physique we'll be skipping over. It's not all that amazing. Then we have Stage Fright. Now, Stage Fright is quite nice because what this does, if the enemy fails the saving throw, they have disadvantage on attack rolls and they take 2d6 psychic damage each time they miss for 3 turns. So a nice little bonus psychic damage about there that also helps enemies miss you. Then we have the Displacer Beast shape. This is a quite nice shape. You could use this, for example, if you want to do some kind of a illithid type of a druid, right? Not gonna go too much into detail there. Then Psionic Overload. Psionic Overload is nice actually, because especially if you can get this as a bonus action. Now, since we're doing some Minthara, that is probably hard or impossible because you would need to go back to the Githyanki Crash. But anyway, what it does is for an action, for the next 10 turns, your attacks deal additional psychic 1d4 psychic damage, but then you take 1d4 psychic damage every turn. So when you end your turn, you will take psychic damage, but you deal extra damage to enemies as well. So it's a quite nice one. Then we have the Transfuse Health. Now, Transfuse Health is nice because you sacrifice half your hit points to heal an ally for that amount. But generally, you won't necessarily need this unless you are in some kind of a real critical situation. But again, potions are really strong, so healing potions are much better than this. This is though useful on builds that, for example, require your health to be 50% or lower. With this, you can instantly drop your health to 50%. Perilous Stakes, another one we will be skipping over, and same thing with Absorber Intellect. Absorber Intellect is underwhelming unless the enemy has low intelligence, then it can kill them, but otherwise not that great. Same thing with Perilous Stakes, it makes you vulnerable or an ally to all damage. In return, your attacks heal you, only really useful towards the end of the combat if you want to heal up on one enemy or the last enemy left, or the last few enemies left. Or if you just really want to kill your ally if there's a lot of enemies and you make them vulnerable to all damage. But anyway, we have also Shield of Throws. We're going to be skipping over that as it's kind of a roadblock. It just gives you temporary hit points, and then when the temporary hit points break, it stuns enemies potentially. The one we want is Free Cast. So you have discovered a marvelous adaptability within yourself. Your spell slots, charges, and similar resources cost costs for your next action or spell are removed and refresh after long rest. So essentially you can get a free spell slot out of this or a similar resource that costs you, well, a resource. Then we have Mind Sanctuary. Now, excuse me. Mind Sanctuary, what it does, it used to be very strong, but for Honor Mode, I believe it was nerfed. So normally what it does, it makes it so that you're hastened, and then you can use your actions and bonus actions interchangeably. So it doesn't matter what it is, it's either or when you're inside of this. And that was a very powerful ability. Now it pretty much just hastens whoever is inside of it, and that is about it. So yeah, it used to be really strong, but then of course a lot of the things for Honor Mode got nerfed to make the game harder, which makes sense. And then I believe we are done. No, we have only one left. This is the Concentrated Blast. Now, this one is also kind of a roadblock for the Sonic Backlash and for Mind Blast, because what it does is if you're concentrating on a spell, you can then break your concentration in so that you deal 36 psychic damage and then heal 36 health, depending on how much damage you do or what the roll is. It's not too great, but yeah, you can still use it. Now, I believe I did not skip over any important ones, so we can go to the actual equipment. So let's start with our headgear. Here we have the Diadem of Arcane Synergy. When you inflict a condition, you gain Arcane Synergy for 2 turns. What this does is basically adds your spellcasting modifier to the damage dealt with your weapon attack. So our weapons will deal additional 4 damage with when we attack. Now for items, I didn't really choose any because I think this one fits quite well. It's very useful since, of course, we have relatively high charisma here after the Mirror of Loss, of course. For our cloak, we're going with the Mantle of the Holy Warrior. What it does is you read the Holy Power that emboldens nearby allies, and their weapons attacks deal additional 1d4 radiant damage. This also applies to you. And we want this because, namely, it is another concentration spell, which is going to be very useful for us. Some other cloaks you could take if you do not want that one particular. You could take Cloak of Displacement, which effectively gives you the effects of Blur at the start of your turn. Or, of course, the Cloak of Protection, which gives you Armor Class and Sanity +1. For the armor, we're going with Minthara's very own armor, the Spider Silk armor. You get +1 bonus to stealth checks, which we don't really care about. The main thing we want from this armor is the advantage on Constitution saving throw checks. So we don't need to use a feat to get Warcaster. We can compensate for that with this armor. For the gloves, we're going with the Legacy of the Masters. You gain +2 bonus to attack rolls and damage rolls with weapons. So increased accuracy with our weapon attacks and also a little bit of higher damage, which is pretty good. For the alternatives, as mentioned, you could get the Gloves of Heroism. When you use your Channel Oath spell, you gain Heroism for, I believe, 10 turns. This makes you immune to being frightened, and you gain temporary hit points every turn. And then the other ones you could take is the Dark Justiciar Gauntlets. Your weapons deal additional 1d4 necrotic damage, and then Strength saving throws +1. Pretty decent little gloves there as well. For the boots, we're going with Minthara's very own boots, which are the Boots of Striding. When you cast a spell that requires concentration, you gain momentum for 1 turn. This is nice when if you cast the spell during combat or if they break concentration, you have to cast a new one. But the secondary effect is much more powerful, which is while you're concentrating, you can't get knocked prone or moved against your will. So you're basically anchored to the ground. They can't move you and they can't knock you prone unless they break a concentration. These boots are going to synergize with one of our rings, which is the Ring of Reaction. You ignore the effects of difficult terrain, you can be paralyzed or restrained. So now they cannot paralyze or restrain us, and then ice or, for example, plant growth and similar type of difficult terrains do not bother us because we move at full speed. Then for the second ring we have is the Strange Conduit Ring. While concentrating on a spell, the wearer's weapon attacks the additional 1d4 psychic damage, so this is going to synergize greatly with our boots, and on top of that, since we are focusing on concentrating spells, we'll get additional psychic damage bonus. For the amulet, we're going with the Spell Savant Amulet. You get an additional level 2 spell slots. We want this because we will have a relatively low number of spell slots anyway, so it is going to help us with that a little bit. Alternatively, or when you use up the spell slots, you could use the Face Amulet's Amulet or the Amulet of the Harpers for the same reason, which is the advantage on Wisdom saving throw checks as a defensive amulet. On top of that, Face Amulet's Amulet gives you also advantage on Intelligence and Charisma saving throws, while the Amulet of the Harpers gives you the Shield spell as a reaction once per long rest. Now for our weapons, we're going with Xanide, which is Minthara's very own mace. Once per short rest, you can encase a target in fairy fire for 2 turns if you miss an attack against it. So this is very useful against bosses who, for example, have high armor class. If you miss them, this can actually help you then get advantage against them for free, essentially. And then for our secondary weapon, we're going with the Adamantine Mace. If an adamantine hits an object, it is always a critical, but the second effect is much nicer. It is the This weapon ignores bludgeoning damage. Now, because this weapon ignores bludgeoning damage, it also transfers that property to our main weapon. So now both of our weapons here will be ignoring bludgeoning damage, which is quite useful. Now, for our ranged weapons, we're going with the Gunther Mel. On a hit, possibly a guiding bolt upon a target, this object shines with a glowing radius of 20 feet, so you can use it for light. It gives you a weapon enchantment +3, which is very useful since you can also use ranged weapons quite reliably since we have high dexterity, and it gives us Celestial Haste. This is basically just a normal haste, except it's 5 turns shorter. But with this one, if you break concentration or the duration expires, you will not be lethargic, so you will not be stunned for 1 turn, which is quite useful. And then we also get one special weapon action, which is the Bolt of Celestial Light. You frighten your target with intimidating arrows. After the attacking, your range attacks made by Gunther Mel deal additional 1d4 radiant damage. So there's a little bit more extra radiant damage. And then for the ranged weapon alternatives, you can take the Hardened Showbow. We have an advantage against most Dorsey type enemies, and it also gives us one more additional concentration spell. For the other one is the Darkfire Shortbow. You gain resistance to lightning and to cold and fire damage, not lightning. And you also get a haste. Now this is a normal haste, which makes you lethargic after the condition ends. And on top of that, I should also mention that you should, of course, try to hoard and stack a bunch of these elixirs, because these are going to be your main damage source for your melee attacks. As you saw before, we had 3 to 8 damage, but now this got boosted to 12 to 17. Or if we think the weaker one is going to be 9 to 14. But then, of course, when you factor in our extra damage from the Strange Conduit Ring and some of our illithid powers, the damage will be quite decent. It won't be out of this world, but it would be pretty good. Alright, so that is it for the equipment. I will now see you in the combat showcase. Alright, so here we are in Flaming Fists Barracks for yet another battle showcase. So before combat started, I did drink a elixir of Cloud Giant Strength. I also casted a Celestial Haste on myself, and I used Valve of Enmity. That is why I am missing a bonus action. Now, I did cast Valve of Enmity on Minthara on herself, and now we have advantage against all of our enemies instead of just one. So now, if you're doing big fights, or generally in a lot of the fights, you would want to open up with the Black Hole. Since it's a short rest, you will get a lot of these over a long turn. Well, long rest, not long turn. You'll get 3 in total, unless you use one of the potions that basically put you in angelic sleep and you regain your... basically, it's as if you took a short rest. But anyway, let's take a look at our spell save DC, because our illithid powers should scale with our charisma, because we're a paladin. So we managed to slow 2 out of 4 of them, which is okay. And then if we take a look at the spell save DC, it is 16. And then if we take a look at our spell save DC, it is 16. So it checks out. It's doing it correctly. So now, since we have grouped them all up here, we could fly over here and then potentially do the Mind Blast to stun them, or we could overload ourselves with Psionic Overload to get extra psychic damage. But since we do have free flight, I'm just gonna go over here and cast Mind Blast to, let's see if I can stun any of these ones. So we managed to stun 2 out of 4, that's pretty good, so we got a 50-50. And then since we have a Action Surge as a fighter, we can use this and keep attacking this guy. But I should also mention, yeah, Minthara does get Soul Branding as a class action, although in the late game you won't really use it because it's only a 3 to 9 fire damage increase, and our bonus action attack deals a lot more damage than that does, so it's not really worth it unless you have no more movement speed left, you have a bonus action left, and then you can cast this on yourself on an ally. But anyway, let's take a look at the damage rolls with our weapon and Savage Attacker, since it should work on our Divine Smites. Now we did get the Arcane Synergy, so we can attack him again. And let's take a look. So we got rolled at 20. We got a 5 out of 1d6 from weapon. We got a +9 from the strength modifier and from the weapon enchantment. Arming enchantment is the gloves, and then +4 from Arcane Synergy. So quite decent damage, 20 damage there, so that's pretty good. For the psychic damage, that's from our ring. As we can see here, that also got rerolled, and we rolled a maximum of 4. And then for our radiant damage, which was a 3d8, we rolled a 21, and it also gets rerolled because of the Savage Attacker. And the same thing is for our previous attacks. So the damage is still pretty good, and let's try to finish this guy up. Hopefully don't miss on our 99. And there we go. So that is it for the build. I hope you enjoyed. I would appreciate if you leave that like and subscribe for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, and I'll see you in the next one.